so much for having me here today. There's nothing an author that's written a book to inspire young women likes more than like staring out at a room full of all of your awesome faces. So I'm so happy to be here. As Julie said, I'm a longtime journalist and I've written for magazines like Elle and Marie Claire and newspapers. But why a book? And what you should know is when you set out to write a book, you're gonna devote like 2 to 3 years of your life to this project. So you really have to care about what you're doing. So this project came from a very deep place in me. And I'm gonna tell you a little bit why. So when I was your age, I really didn't imagine myself doing big things in the world. I certainly never imagined myself inventing a technology to edit disease-causing genes, or to fly a plane like the young woman I met this morning, or a novel way to harness clean power. In 3rd grade, my elementary school had a career fair, and the 2 activities, I'm gonna see if I'm doing this right, the 2 activities I chose were to learn about hairdressing and cake decorating. Clearly, I had internalized some pretty traditional notions about who does what jobs. Some of this came from my home. My dad was a lawyer and he had an important career and got lots of public praise for fighting for justice and human rights. My mom was a teacher. She always worked, but her work was definitely secondary. Her priority was manning the home front. Her female friends were social workers and artists, and many of them stayed home. Dad handled all the money. He paid our taxes. He had important business trips and dinners. When I went to college, I studied literature, which is exactly what my mom had done. I didn't have my own strong passion, so I went with what was familiar. By the time I got to my 20s, I had a real revelation. I was living on my own. I yearned to be independent, and I wanted to take care of myself. Feelings that women weren't meant to hold the real power jobs started affecting me. That was in 1995. I applied to Stanford Business School, and I surprised myself by getting in. I didn't expect that would happen for me. That felt like the path that would set me up for legitimacy and financial security. Among the students, though, the girls at Stanford Business School were outnumbered 2 to 1. And that time, 25 years ago, there was not a single female CEO in the Fortune 500, which is the 500 biggest companies in America. So not surprisingly, we read lots and lots of cases about the leaders that were running America and American business, and they were all men. What happened in the decade that followed is I had my daughter, Emma, who I like to say popped out with her hands on her hips, issuing orders first to her dolls and then to anyone who would listen. We were all captive while she played school, where she always appointed herself either principal or teacher. You weren't allowed to leave the room until she finished with you. And when it came time for her 5th birthday, what she asked for was a giant whiteboard so that she could keep extensive to-do lists. And she's still doing these today. So here's my born leader. She's my CEO to be. But I had to ask myself, will she become one? The numbers are definitely not on her side. In fact, 2 weeks before my book came out, powerful Forbes magazine, which is probably the most famous financial publication in America, published one of their annual lists, which they titled America's 100 Top Innovators List. The list had 99 men and 1 woman. The list got lots of attention, but thankfully it was not the kind of attention the magazine hoped. I posted my own version on Instagram to give Forbes some ideas for next time. Today, 25 years has passed since I graduated from business school, but in America's 500 biggest companies, there are still just 6% female CEOs. So this is what 6% looks like. And put more jarringly, there are more CEOs named Jeffrey in the largest 100 companies in America than there are female CEOs. It's as if there are no women doing amazing change-making things to start a company around. But what surprised me when I started researching women for the book wasn't how few there were, but how many. It was impossible for me to choose who to include. And this gets me to the premise for the book. They are out there, but they are not visible. They're definitely not visible enough. They are not being elevated and spotlighted. Girls need to see them, because you cannot be what you cannot see. We need to push entrepreneurial, enterprising women to the forefront. Girls need to be clear that this is possible for them. In school, you learn all about the pioneering women of yesterday. Heroic women like Marie Curie and Katherine Johnson, who was one of the hidden figures who passed away, unfortunately, last week. But there's nothing that's being written about today's pioneering women. You need to know them. Forbes magazine needs to know them. Boys need to know them, because they are inventing the critical technologies for tomorrow. Just a few weeks ago, I heard an amazing story on NPR about CRISPR, which is a gene editing technology that is curing African Americans of sickle cell anemia, a horrid disease that affects 90,000, mostly Black Americans every year. And Rachel Harwitz, who's in my book and the CEO of Caribou Biosciences, is pioneering the CRISPR effort. I believe putting these stories out there will change perceptions of who gets to be a CEO in America. Since my goal is elevating these stories, I'm going to share a couple of my favorite ones with you today. So have you all ever heard of a company called Spanx, or a woman named Sarah Blakely? Yeah? So these are the illustrations from my book, and they're done by this amazing woman, Bijou Carmen, who Prada and Rolling Stone is now hiring to do work for them. I always say I got her for my first book, but if I do a follow-on, I'll never get her again because she's getting so famous. But so to tell you about Sarah, so this is how she started her business, Spanx. She's walking around in Atlanta where she's selling fax machines door to door. She had wanted to work in Disneyland as one, she was loved acting, so she wanted to be one of the big major characters. But when she went to the tryout, she got cast as a chipmunk. So she decided, no, not that. I'll sell the fax machines. So because she had to kind of get dressy for work, she was wearing hose underneath her pants. Then her panty line wouldn't show, and she was just roasting hot, miserably uncomfortable. So one day she takes the stockings and she just chops off the bottoms of the legs. And she thinks to herself, God, could be a really cool invention. I bet my mom would want these, and my sister, and their friends. So I should go and make a bunch of samples and get them to try it out. So the first thing she does is she asks her boss for a week of vacation. So she takes her precious vacation time. She drives 2 states away, and she just starts knocking on doors at these different male manufacturers who all ask her, who are you, and where are you from, and who's funding you? And they just raise their eyebrows, give her a skeptical look, and shut the door. But she persists, and she asks about 40 different manufacturers until she finds one who will make samples for her. Then she decides, I need to patent this idea because it's a really powerful idea, and I bet someone might try to steal it. So how does she write a patent? She can't afford a lawyer, so she goes to the library, she gets a book, How to Write a Patent, and she writes her own patent, and that is still the patent that holds today. Then, when she decided she wanted to get her product that now she had manufactured carried in a department store, she picks up the phone and she makes cold calls, which means a call where you just call out of the blue, you introduce yourself, you don't know anyone. And she got a buyer from Neiman Marcus on the phone, and she was persuasive enough to get a 10-minute meeting, and then she was able to sell them on giving it a try in the store. So the first time she goes into the store, first of all her product is arriving at her house. And so many boxes are arriving, she hasn't thought this through, that some days she can't even get back inside her house. So she's got to ask her neighbors to move the boxes so she can open the door. When she visits her product for the first time inside Neiman Marcus, they're way off in what she calls the hosiery hinterlands. And the red boxes that she's worked so hard at are collecting dust. And she's just thinking, this will never do. These are going to never sell. So this is what she does. She darts down the street to Target. She buys a rack that's about this tall. She hides it inside the big coat that she has on. She takes the elevator back up to the 4th floor, and she sets this thing up at the register, right in front, and she moves her boxes. She doesn't ask permission. She pretends she belongs there. So it's a pretty amazing display of moxie. So this is a word that I've been using a lot, and as Julie said, it's chutzpah, or you could say cojones, or just major gutsiness. And that is the trait that really runs throughout so many of the women in the book. And it means putting yourself out there and really making yourself vulnerable, because something bad is probably going to happen, but you're going to have a tough skin and you're just going to live through it. And very likely that's the only way to get from here to there. And that's what all of these women did. And so I'm going to tell you another great story that will just explain to you what I mean by the word moxie. That it's best explained by this story, which is, do you know the company Rent the Runway? Yes. So the founder of Rent the Runway is Jen Hyman, and she had gone over a Thanksgiving vacation to visit her sister. This is Jen is on the right, and Jenny Fleiss is on the left, and that's her partner in Rent the Runway. So Jen is home visiting her sister for Thanksgiving, and she sees all these fancy dresses for functions that her sister is buying. And she says, "You're crazy, you're running up your credit card debt, you can't afford this." And what her sister says is, "Once these pictures have shown on Instagram, the dress is dead to me. I can't wear it again." So Jen thinks, first of all, this is terrible for the planet, because the textile industry is like the most polluting industry out there. So she thinks what would be a better way would be if people were renting dresses. So she gets this idea in her head. She comes back to school. She finds her friend Jenny. Jenny's like, "I love that. Let's do it." So the first thing they do is they get this idea in their head that they should get in touch with the most famous dress designer who's just been in the industry forever. Her name's Diana Furstenberg. And she's known for inventing the wrap dress. But neither of them knew her, and they didn't know anyone who knew her. So this is what they did. To get in touch with her, they just start guessing possible emails that could be Diane's email. And they're just sitting there, they type like 20 different things into the computer until they get one that doesn't bounce. And she writes them right back. And she says, "This is a cool idea. If you guys will come to Manhattan," they're in Boston, "if you'll come to Manhattan in a week from Friday, I can spend an hour with you on Friday afternoon. I'd love to hear more about your idea." So Jen and Jenny, the first thing they do is they run out and buy themselves some Diane von Furstenberg dresses. They rent a car, they drive into Manhattan. They name the company while they're in the car on the way so that they can introduce themselves as, "We're the CEOs of Rent the Runway." They're 10 minutes outside of Manhattan when they get a call on the cell phone, and it's Diane's assistant, and she says, "Jen, I feel so bad about this. This is the worst call to have to make, but Diane cannot make this afternoon work. Something has come up, and I hate to say it, but I don't think she's going to be able to reschedule this meeting." And what Jen does in that moment is she holds the phone out here and she says, What? I don't hear you. My cell phone is broken up. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She shows up at this building anyway. And that is moxie, okay? Right there. Put that idea in your pocket and hold on to it. And the way she was able to do it is by asking herself this question. And this is another question I always tell young people to put into their pocket, which is, when you're thinking about doing something that feels kind of scary, ask yourself, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? And if you actually play that out and you ask yourself what are the possible outcomes, so Jen was like, well, I might be really embarrassed to get escorted out, I might drive further into the city, pay for parking, and never be able to get into the building, but like none of those things seemed so bad to her. So she went ahead anyway, and she actually did have the meeting with Diane. And she wasn't able to convince her right then to rent the dresses as kind of like the start of her business, but later on she did. And she also didn't leave that meeting without getting Diane to give her 3 industry contacts that she could then go on and take the next step and find people who would, come in early into this rental business. And what she says is, you never want to leave the meeting with the promise that I'm going to provide you contacts. You leave the meeting with the actual contacts in your hand. Don't expect that you're going to be able to get them by phone or email later. So you do it right then. So that's a good tip for you. So in interviewing choosing 30 women, 31 women, I initially was doing a book about 30, but I wanted the women from Soul Cycle to be in the book, and when they agreed to do it, it's a pair. So that's how I ended up with an odd number, 31. And there's a lot of covers of the book that are out there on the internet that still says 30. But so there was a couple of themes that really jumped out at me when I was doing the research for the book. First, almost all of the women that start these businesses have no idea what they're doing before they get started. They are not preordained to do this. They don't have parents who are entrepreneurs. They don't have a special degree that leads them to be able to do this. Katrina Lake, who founded Stitch Fix, didn't know anything about the apparel or clothing industry. This is Jane Chen, and she is the founder of a really interesting company called Embrace. And basically, she has saved 300,000 premature babies in the developing world by creating a low-cost incubator that can hold body heat in for babies without having to use electricity, which is such a problem in the developing world. So she created this little, it's almost like a little snowsuit that's for babies. And what she found was a material that you can heat under water, hot water, and then it will retain body heat for 8 hours. And I asked her, how did you figure out what this magic material would be that would retain body heat? And she said, I just did interviewing and Googling of people in the world of science. This is Christina Stembel, who founded a great company called Farm Girl Flowers. She grew up on a farm. She never went to college. She started the business in her bathtub in a small apartment in San Francisco. She went to the flower mart in the mornings, bought huge buckets of flowers. And she told me that the way that she learned to care for her flowers and to do these beautiful arrangements that she's now having people bike around and deliver is by watching YouTube. She said, Diana, I swear I went to the University of YouTube. This is Katrina Lake at Stitch Fix, and same story. She put $5,000 worth of jeans and shirts and belts and skirts on her credit card. She kept track of which ones had a 15 and a 30-day return policy, so that if the people that she sent the boxes out to didn't like the clothes, she could still return them. She just sent the boxes out initially to her friends. She hired a task rabbit, which is kind of this errand person you can pay that you find on the internet, to compile all the feedback she had from her friends on what they thought of the clothes that she chose and turn it into kind of quantitative data. And now her company is worth over $1 billion. So the reason I'm so excited to be talking about all of this is I really feel like we have reached an inflection point in America where things are really turning around for women. Women's voices absolutely matter. They will most likely decide this election. Women make the majority of purchasing decisions. There's a massive recognition that we need to harness all of our talent in order to compete in the 21st century economy. How we elevate women in every realm is a major topic of conversation on the news, on college campuses, on Wall Street. Goldman Sachs just announced that if you don't have women on your board, they won't take your company public. In venture capital meetings, it's a major topic. And one of the ways things are changing that you can just notice down on the ground level is even the Girl Scouts is now run by a woman who is an actual rocket scientist, and all their newest badges are STEM related. So things like how to build a robot, how to become an engineer are the kinds of badges you get now. At the most recent World Cup, the stands were full of people screaming, pay equity, when the women in the US won the World Cup. 35 new women entered Congress in the wave that came through in 2018, the most ever. 5 women took a real run at becoming president, and the 2 that the New York Times chose to endorse were women. The face of climate science today is a 16-year-old girl, I'm sure you all know her, Greta Thunberg. The woman who's fighting the fight against handgun violence is a young woman, Emma Gonzalez. We already are getting data that female-founded companies outperform companies founded by males. And this is early data. There isn't a ton of research yet, but the early indicators show that startups founded by women on average have a 35% higher return on investment. This is a recent Forbes cover. These 36 female venture capitalists have founded an organization in the Bay Area called All Raise, and they've made very specific targets about how they're going to increase the amount of funding that goes to back female-led companies. Right now, the statistic is really horrifying. Of all the $80 billion that's being spent to fund new small companies founded by entrepreneurs, just 2% of that pool of money is going to female-led businesses, and just 0.02%, so not even 1%, is going to companies founded by a woman of color. So there's a lot of change that has to happen, but it's definitely on the radar. And the way to start, these women believe, is you have to increase the number of venture capital partners in the firms, because those are the people who are making the decisions about what businesses to fund. And so you gotta start there, and they're doing that. For the first time, women hold the top jobs at the New York Stock Exchange and at NASDAQ. 4 out of 5 of America's biggest defense contractors are right now run by women. This is Katrina Lake when she took her company public, and it's a really powerful image in my view because it shows how much is changing. First of all, a young single woman had never been the CEO of a company that went public before Katrina Lake, and she went up there with her 2-year-old son. When he screamed, she stuffed a bagel in his mouth. But it's this kind of image that you start to see it in culture, and it really starts to normalize that it's okay to be a mother and a CEO. Just last year, the founder of The Wing, a woman named Audrey Gelman, she posed 8 months pregnant on the cover of Inc. magazine, and it's the first time a pregnant CEO had ever been on the cover of a magazine, so that's real change. So this is what I'll leave you with. The glass ceiling has cracked. There's lots of reason for optimism. The women CEOs in this book are not superheroes. What they have done, you can do too. They don't have all the answers. They don't have perfect training. They don't have a manual. There isn't one. But they are willing to jump in. They take huge risks. Sometimes they look stupid. They always get messy. They learn more from what goes bad than from what goes well. And they figure things out as they go along. There is no manual when you're a pioneer, and that's what makes it exciting and fun. So forget about being perfect, and instead figure out what you're really jazzed about doing. And I'll leave you with a few questions to ask yourselves. What really moves you? How will you share your talents with the world? What problem will you solve? And then just go out and get started.